The world had already fallen by the time they realized what had happened. The Exarach Dominion had come like a storm, sweeping across the skies with their sleek black warships, blocking out the sun as they released the bioweapon. It was silent, invisible, and engineered plague that targeted only one thing: human males. Within days, fathers, brothers, soldiers, and leaders collapsed in the streets. Governments crumbled, armies lost their strength, and the world was thrown into chaos. The aliens watched from orbit, convinced that they had won. A species without its men, they thought, could not fight back. They had no idea how wrong they were. Deep in a remote wilderness camp, Girl Scout Troop 77 was preparing for their annual survival retreat when the world went dark. At first, they thought it was some sort of blackout, but then the emergency broadcasts came: panicked voices warning of an invasion, reports of men dying by the millions, entire cities falling silent. Their camp leader, Captain Ramirez, a retired Marine who had volunteered to teach them survival skills, knew instantly that this was no ordinary disaster. She gathered the girls, checked the supplies, and prepared them for the worst. But she didn't have to convince them to fight; they were already ready. Days passed, then weeks. The Exarach forces landed, marching through ruined cities, gathering whatever technology or resources they wanted. They barely noticed the small bands of surviving women trying to regroup, and they certainly didn't pay attention to a handful of young girls and their instructor out in the woods. That was their first mistake, because while the world burned, Troop 77 was training. What had once been simple exercises tying knots, starting fires, setting up shelters became lessons in traps, ambushes, and sabotage. Shooting practice with bows and slingshots became sniper drills with stolen alien weapons. Orienteering turned into recon missions. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were preparing for war. Their first strike came under the cover of night. A small Exarach supply convoy was making its way through the remains of a highway, carrying food, weapons, and power cells. The aliens didn't even think to set up a proper guard. After all, the war was already over, wasn't it? But then came the trap's carefully placed wire across the road, homemade explosives disguised as debris, silent figures moving through the darkness like ghosts. The first explosion flipped the lead transport. The second disabled the rear. And then the girls struck. They moved fast, too fast for the Exarach to react. Stealth, speed, precision, taking down enemies with their own weapons, vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. When the aliens finally investigated the wreckage, all they found was a small Girl Scout badge pinned to the destroyed transport. Word of the attack spread. More resistance groups began forming, inspired by the sudden shift in power. The Exarach grew uneasy. They had underestimated human women, thinking them weak, thinking that without men, Earth would be easy to conquer. But now, entire outposts were going silent. Patrols went missing. Their own technology was being used against them. They were being hunted. And the worst part? They had no idea by who. The girls didn't stop. Every mission was bigger, bolder, deadlier. They learned how to hack alien communication systems, sending false reports, luring enemy forces into ambushes. They stole armor, weapons, and vehicles, disguising themselves as captured troops to infiltrate bases. They weren't just a scout troop anymore. They were an army in the shadows. Then came their most dangerous mission, yet the heart of the Exarach operation, a command station deep in the mountains, controlling the orbital fleet above. If they could take it down, Earth would finally stand a chance at real resistance. It was impossible. The place was heavily fortified, guarded by war machines and energy barriers. But impossible was just another challenge. Troop 77 had faced worse. Under cover of a storm, they moved in. Climbing cliffs, sneaking past drones, cutting through security systems. One by one, they disabled the defenses, moving like whispers through the base. The Exarach inside never saw it coming. Explosions rocked the mountain as power generators were destroyed. The fleet above lost contact, their warships now blind and vulnerable. And then, just as the last alarm sounded, the girls left one final message. Behind a simple note, written in neat handwriting, pinned to the control panel of the burning command center. The Girl Scouts are watching. That was the night the war changed. The Exarac Dominion, for the first time in their history, knew fear. Their ships, once untouchable, were now being hunted from the ground. Their troops, once the conquerors, were now the prey. They had wiped out Earth's men, but in doing so, they had awakened something far worse. They had created the deadliest soldiers humanity had ever seen. And they were just getting started. The sky was burning the day the Exarac Dominion released their bioweapon. It spread faster than anyone could react, a silent killer that wiped out every human male on the planet within days. Fathers, brothers, soldiers, and leaders all gone. The world crumbled overnight. The aliens, towering figures in dark armor, marched through ruined cities, their warships blocking out the sun as they took whatever they wanted. They didn't expect resistance. Why would they? The war was over, and Earth was defenseless. At least, that's what they thought. But they had overlooked the last survivors, those the Exarac had dismissed as insignificant. Because hidden in the ruins of a once busy city, Troop 99 was planning their revenge. They had started as just a regular Girl Scout troop baking cookies, camping, earning badges. Now, their once innocent training had turned into something much deadlier. Their leader, Ava Carter, had been an ordinary teenager before the invasion. But when the world fell apart, she had been forced to change. She watched as the Exarac walked through the streets like kings, rounding up technology, setting up bases, and crushing what little resistance remained. She saw how they ignored the survivors, assuming that without men, humanity would never fight back. It was a mistake they wouldn't live long enough to regret. The first strike was small. A single transport convoy moving through the city, its alien soldiers laughing as they passed through the wreckage. They never even saw the tripwire. The explosion flipped the lead vehicle, and before the dust settled, the girls struck. Quick, silent, precise. They moved like shadows, using slingshots, stolen rifles, and makeshift traps. When the fight was over, the aliens lay dead, their bodies left in the streets with a message written in white chalk: "The Girl Scouts are watching." Word spread fast. The Exarac, at first amused by the idea of human children fighting back, soon realized this was no joke. The attacks increased, supply depots went up in flames, communication towers collapsed, and patrols began disappearing. The troop had turned an abandoned bakery into their headquarters, using underground tunnels to move unseen. With each mission, they grew bolder. They learned how to hijack Exarac drones, how to forge EMP grenades out of scrap, how to use the city itself as a weapon. But their most dangerous plan was still ahead, infiltrating the alien war factory. The factory was where the Exarac built their exo-armor, thick-plated suits that made them nearly invincible in battle. If the girls could steal one, they could learn how to turn the aliens' own technology against them. But breaking into the factory was impossible. Surveillance drones patrolled the skies, security turrets guarded every entrance, and the facility was crawling with Exarac enforcers. But impossible was just another challenge. They had one advantage: the Exarac still didn't see them as a real threat. Ava led the infiltration. Disguised as refugees, the girls slipped into the facility hidden in a supply truck. Once inside, they moved fast, spreading through the facility in pairs, planting explosives, hacking security systems, cutting the power. By the time the alarms blared, it was too late. The stolen armor suit was already in their hands. The troop had their first real weapon, and they weren't stopping there. The next attacks were devastating. The girls modified the armor, learning its weak spots, turning it into their own battle gear. They didn't just fight, they hunted. Using stolen access codes, they lured squads into traps, turned their own defenses against them, and spread fear through the alien ranks. No one knew where they would strike next. And with every mission, they left behind the same mocking message: "Would you like to buy some cookies?" The final battle came when the Exarac, desperate and enraged, deployed their elite warlord, Commander T-Vor, to wipe out the resistance. He promised to bring back the heads of the rebels as trophies. But when he reached the heart of the city, he found nothing but empty streets and silence. Then came the explosion, an entire building collapsing onto his forces. Before the dust settled, the girls attacked from the shadows. They had turned the city into their weapon, using every street, every alley, every rooftop to strike and vanish before the Exarch could react. Tvor, covered in dust, barely had time to react before a single grenade rolled to his feet, one disguised as a box of thin mint. When the dust settled, the battlefield was quiet. The Exarch, once so sure of their victory, now faced a world where they were the ones being hunted. Ava stood on the rooftops, watching as the last surviving alien transports fled the city, their warlord gone, their forces broken. She turned to her troop, their faces smeared with dirt, their hands gripping stolen weapons, their eyes burning with the fire of victory. The war wasn't over yet, but humanity had already won its first real battle. The aliens thought they had destroyed Earth's defenders. They never expected the Girl Scouts. The war had ended before it even began. The Exarch Dominion descended on Earth like a plague, unleashing their bioweapon into the atmosphere. It was quick, silent, and efficient, a genetically engineered virus that wiped out every human male. In just days, cities fell silent. The Exarch did not expect any resistance. Why would they? With the men gone, who was left to fight? They believed their victory was absolute. But in the dense forests of North America, beyond the ruins of a fallen world, one troop of survivors was preparing to prove them wrong. Troop 44 had been on a routine survival camp when the world ended. Their leader, Captain Melissa Kane, a former Special Forces operative turned youth instructor, had been teaching them how to build fires, navigate the wild, and track animals. She had always believed in preparedness. But no amount of training could have prepared them for the end of civilization. When the girls heard the news, when they realized their fathers, brothers, and everyone they had known were gone, rage replaced grief. The Exarch had stolen their world, their future, and they were going to take it back. For weeks, they watched. The Exarch were arrogant, their towering armored soldiers patrolling the ruins, securing supply lines, setting up bases. They ignored the survivors, believing them harmless. It was a mistake they would regret. The first attack came when a small Xerac scouting party entered the forest. The aliens never returned. Their bodies were found days later, stripped of their weapons, their armor missing. The only thing left behind was a single Girl Scout badge pinned to a tree. The Exarch were confused. They did not understand how unarmed civilians had managed to kill their warriors. They increased patrols, searching for resistance fighters. But the girls did not fight like soldiers. They fought like hunters. Using the forests to their advantage, they set traps, thin wires across trails, pits covered with leaves, makeshift explosives built from salvaged supplies. They moved in silence, striking only when the enemy was weak, taking their weapons and disappearing before reinforcements arrived. The Exarch thought they were facing an organized army. They had no idea they were being hunted by a group of teenage girls. Melissa knew that small attacks would not be enough. If they wanted to truly cripple the enemy, they needed to go bigger. The Exarch were building a command station in the heart of the ruins, a massive stronghold meant to control the entire region. Inside, they had stockpiles of weapons, vehicles, and a transmitter that allowed them to coordinate with the warships in orbit. If the girls could take the stronghold, they could disrupt the entire invasion. But the fortress was heavily guarded, its walls patrolled by dozens of soldiers, its gates protected by energy barriers. It was an impossible target. So they did not attack the walls. They infiltrated from within. Disguising themselves in stolen armor, they slipped past the guards, hiding weapons inside crates of stolen supplies. Once inside, they moved quickly, cutting power, sabotaging security systems, jamming communications. The Exarch did not realize the danger until the first explosion rocked the stronghold, fire erupting from storage chambers, sending the aliens into chaos. And then, the girls struck. Moving through the smoke-filled corridors, they took down the Exarch one by one, using the very weapons they had stolen. Melissa led the charge, a knife in one hand, a plasma rifle in the other, cutting through the enemy like a ghost of vengeance. The aliens, once so certain of their superiority, now found themselves cornered, outmaneuvered, afraid. The battle reached its peak when they entered the command center. The lead Exarch officer, towering in thick armor, stood between them and the control panel. His deep voice rumbled as he laughed, mocking them for thinking they could win. But Melissa did not waste words. She simply raised her rifle and fired. The plasma shot struck the officer's helmet, cracking it open. He staggered, stunned. And before he could react, one of the girls, Emily, the quietest of the troop, threw a badge straight at his chest. It was not just a badge. It was an explosive. The officer barely had time to look down before the detonation ripped through his armor, sending him crashing to the ground. The battle was over. With the HFY command center in ruins, the troop activated the transmitter. Instead of jamming communications, they turned it against the enemy, sending out a message to all surviving humans. The fight is not over. The Girl Scouts are leading the charge. Across the world, the resistance heard the call. Women who had thought they were alone, who had believed that all hope was lost, now knew the truth. Humanity was still fighting. And the war had only just begun. As the sun rose over the burning stronghold, Troop 44 stood victorious. They had no superweapons, no fleets, no armies. But they had something stronger: determination, unity, and the will to fight until every last Exarch was wiped from their planet. They had come to the forest as ordinary girls. Now they wore the badge of vengeance. The world ended in silence. One day, fathers, brothers, teachers, and leaders were there. The next, they were gone. The Exarch had unleashed their bioweapon without warning, a virus designed to wipe out every human male on Earth. They didn't arrive with massive fleets or towering war machines. They didn't need to. With humanity's armies crippled, resistance was crushed before it could even begin. The Exarch landed without fear, claiming the ruins as their own, treating the survivors as nothing more than background noise. To them, humanity was already dead. They were wrong. In the outskirts of what was once Chicago, a small group of survivors watched from the shadows. Troop 17 had once been a simple Girl Scout troop selling cookies, earning badges, and going on weekend camping trips. But now, they were all that was left. Their troop leader, Jessie Morales, was just 17, but the war had made her harder than steel. She had seen the Exarch march through the city, rounding up survivors, burning anything they couldn't use. She had seen them laugh as they destroyed Earth's history, treating human culture like garbage. Most of all, she had seen their weakness. The Exarch weren't gods. They weren't invincible. They could bleed. And if they could bleed, they could die. The first strike was small, a single patrol moving through the ruins. The girls waited in the crumbling remains of an old bakery, watching as the armored aliens passed by. The leader of the patrol, a tall Exarch warrior with a scarred faceplate, barely had time to react before a homemade explosive rolled between his feet. The blast sent the squad flying, their weapons clattering to the ground. Before the dust settled, the girls struck. They moved fast, using slingshots, knives, and stolen plasma rifles. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the Exarch were dead, their bodies stripped of armor. Jessie took the leader's helmet and placed it on the counter, next to an old box of thin mints covered in dust. The war had begun. The Exarch dismissed the attack at first. They assumed it was the work of straggling soldiers or scavengers, but then came the next strike. And the next. Supply lines were cut. Communication towers collapsed. The aliens started finding their own weapons turned against them, plasma turrets rewired to fire at their own forces. With each attack, the humans left behind a calling card, a single cookie. Jessie's plan wasn't just about fighting back. It was about making the Exarch afraid. She wanted them to question every shadow, every sound, every abandoned building. The aliens had thought Earth was already conquered. Now they were learning what real war felt like. But the Exarch weren't fools. They adapted. They set traps, deployed tracking drones, hunted the survivors without mercy. One by one, Jessie's scouts started disappearing. The troop was forced deeper into the ruins, always moving, always hiding. Supplies were running low. They couldn't keep fighting like this forever. They needed to end the war before it ended them. That's when Jessie came up with the most dangerous plan yet, stealing the Exarch command codes. The aliens controlled their warships through a central relay station, located in a massive tower that once belonged to one of Earth's most powerful corporations. If they could get inside, they could shut down Xeric defenses long enough to send out a distress signal. There were still human survivors off-world, hiding in deep space. If they could call for help, there was still a chance for victory. The plan was madness. But madness was all they had left. The night of the attack, the girls moved like ghosts through the ruins, using tunnels and abandoned buildings to reach the tower. Jesse and three others, Riley, Sam, and Ava, climbed through a collapsed section of the wall, dodging patrols and security drones. Inside, the air smelled like burning metal and alien chemicals. The Xerac had turned it into something unrecognizable, but that didn't matter. They weren't here to admire the scenery. They split up, moving fast. Jesse reached the control room first, taking out a lone Xerac guard with a silent strike to the throat. She plugged in the stolen uplink device, hands shaking as she typed. The alien language on the screen was unreadable, but she had spent weeks studying their systems. She knew enough. Then came the alarm. Riley's voice crackled through the stolen radio. "They found us. We have to go now." Jessie cursed, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Just a few more seconds. The doors slammed open as Xerac soldiers stormed in. Jessie grabbed a plasma grenade from her belt and threw it toward the console. The explosion knocked her back, blowing apart the entire command system. Smoke filled the room as sirens blared. Jessie staggered to her feet, chest burning, vision blurry. But she saw the screen flicker, then the distress signal sent. The mission was complete. She barely made it out. Riley dragged her through the chaos as explosions rocked the tower. The remaining girls fought like demons, cutting through the Xerac with a fury that even the aliens had never seen before. When they finally escaped into the night, the tower was already falling, its structure collapsing in flames. The Xerac had lost their relay. Their communications were in ruins. And far beyond Earth's skies, human warships received the call. The real battle was about to begin. ASE, the troop regrouped, breathing hard. Jessie reached into her pocket and pulled out the last surviving cookie. A single thin mint, cracked from the fight but still intact. She looked at the city behind her, burning, broken, but still standing. She broke the cookie in half and handed a piece to Riley, smiling for the first time in months. "We're not done yet." The Xerac came without warning, unleashing a virus that wiped out every human male on Earth in just a matter of days. Cities fell silent, armies crumbled, and the invaders walked through the ruins as if they had already won. The Xerac believed that humanity was too weak to fight back. They thought the remaining women and girls were nothing more than survivors, too broken to resist. They were wrong. In the heart of what was once the American Midwest, a single Girl Scout troop remained hidden in the forests, watching, waiting. Troop 22 had been on a wilderness survival trip when the world ended, deep in the woods where the virus never reached them. Their leader, Sergeant Olivia Carter, had once been a soldier, a war veteran turned youth instructor. She knew what the Xerac had done. She knew they thought Earth was theirs now. But she also knew something the aliens didn't. Her girls were ready for war. For weeks, they studied the enemy from the shadows. The Xerac patrols moved in predictable patterns. Their bases were lightly defended. Their supply chains stretched too thin. They were conquerors, not warriors. They had never fought against humans who knew the land, who could move unseen, who could turn the ruins into their own battlefield. Olivia trained the girls to think like hunters. They wouldn't face the enemy head-on. They would strike from the dark and disappear before the aliens even knew what hit them. The first attack came at dusk. A small Xerac patrol moved along a broken highway, scanning for survivors. The girls waited in the wreckage of an old gas station, hidden among the rusted cars. When the moment was right, they attacked. Slingshots fired steel ball bearings, smashing into alien visors. Traps lined the road wires snapped, sending the Xerac crashing to the ground. The aliens barely had time to react before Olivia and the older scouts moved in, finishing them off with stolen plasma rifles. The entire patrol was wiped out in under a minute. But that was only the beginning. The Xerac assumed the attack was random, a desperate act by scavengers. They didn't realize that over the next few weeks, their supply lines would begin to collapse. Fuel depots went up in flames, communication towers crumbled, and outposts were found abandoned, their soldiers gone, their weapons stolen. The Exuric started to fear the ruins, whispering among themselves about the ghosts of the fallen. They didn't understand who they were really fighting. Then came the mission that would change the war. Olivia had discovered something, a transport hub deep in the Exuric-controlled zone. The aliens used it to move captured humans off-world, sending them to unknown fates. The scouts knew they couldn't let that continue. They had to destroy it. But this time, the mission wasn't just sabotage. It was a rescue. The girls planned for days. They studied maps, memorized patrol routes, built weapons from whatever they could scavenge. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to take their world back. When the night of the attack came, they moved like shadows. Dressed in stolen armor, they walked straight into the transport hub, pretending to be prisoners under escort. The Exuric guards barely gave them a second glance. They were arrogant. They thought humans were too weak to fight back. That was their last mistake. The moment they reached the central control room, the ambush began. A scout named Ellie dropped to the ground and rolled a plasma grenade into the security post. The explosion sent guards flying. Olivia took down the nearest Exuric with a stolen rifle, while the younger scouts moved fast, unlocking the holding cells. Terrified survivors poured out, women and children who'd been captured, waiting for transport to an unknown fate. The Exuric tried to fight back, but they were outmaneuvered. The scouts had disabled their alarms, sabotaged their weapons cache, and set charges throughout the base. By the time the aliens realized they were losing, it was already over. As the freed prisoners ran for the escape route, Olivia gave the final order. Blow it. A deafening explosion ripped through the facility, sending flames and debris into the sky. The transport hub was gone. The Exuric had lost one of their most valuable strongholds, and for the first time, they realized Earth was not theirs. The scouts retreated into the ruins, victorious. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the first strike in a war that would spread across the planet. The Exuric had come to conquer. Instead, they had awakened something far worse. Humanity was fighting back, and Troop 22 was leading the charge.